Hello, my name is Brandon Henderson, and I'm a assistant professor at the Joan C. Edwards School of Medicine at Marshall University. So I'll mention that I am a PhD, not an MD, so take that into consideration. So I'll also say that since we're talking about nicotine and tobacco and vaping, I'm one of two co-chairs for the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco. So I say that just to specify that I'm deeply immersed in the field of nicotine and tobacco. But also I say that to specify that what I'm going to say are my views and my views entirely, and they don't represent the views of the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco. So what I plan to do for this session is, for those of you that are returning viewers of last year's virtual event, you may recognize me because I gave one of the presentations last year, but I thought of doing this as a part two, but also what are the current most frequently asked questions when it comes to vaping and e-cigarettes. And essentially, so what I did was I went to Twitter, because that's always the best source of information, serious, not serious, but what are the most frequent questions regarding vaping, and I'll give you the answers from an experienced basic scientist within the field of nicotine and tobacco. So, without further ado, first question is, are vaping devices just essentially water vapor with some nicotine mixed in? So, that is a very, it's not that complicated, so the easy answer is no, that's not the case. So when it comes to all vaping devices, whether they're a pod-based device or disposable-based device, so think about puff bars or disposable, Juul is a popular pod-based device, and if you go to using a tank device where you can refill the liquid, so those are composed entirely of a mixture of propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin. So those are chemicals that when heated can make other chemicals that you then inhale. So the reason why they use that is essentially to dissolve nicotine and any other flavor that they have. And we'll talk about flavors in a little bit. So since it's not water vapor, as many believe, the next typical question is, what do we know about those chemicals? And so some of the things that we've known through basic science is that propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin, they can create other chemicals, excuse me while I caffeinate, that can cause a series of different types of effects. So chief among these, that many people in the field of toxicology, those are scientists in the field that study toxicity of any type of compound that can come into contact with the human body. So some of the things that they're concerned about are what are called reactive carbonyls. And so if you ask the people that are investigating the toxicity of the chemicals that are created through the use of propylene glycol, vegetable glycerin, I'll just refer to it as PGVG from here on. It's mostly due to the formation of different types of chemicals called carbonyls or aldehydes. One of these you may know, formaldehyde, because that is used in embalming. And if you've seen any type, it's come up in many types of popular media, TV shows, movies, so you can understand why you may not want to inhale some of these compounds. So the clear-cut answer of how toxic these compounds are is still under investigation. Thus far, there have been cellular studies that have shown that particular types of toxicants are being created. So I have a cheat sheet over here because I can't remember them all. So we'll go through this. There's formaldehyde, acetaldehyde. Those are classified as carcinogens by the IARC. There's also acetone and acrolein, and those are listed as membrane irritants. And there's a few other chemicals that are listed here. But the chief thing is at the bare minimum, these are compounds that are shown to be toxic to lung tissue. They're shown to be potential carcinogens. So the real question is, in vaping products, is the concentration that you're being exposed to sufficient to basically, trigger cancer, to trigger anything that would be detrimental to the cells in the lungs? And this is one of the things that's still being debated and examined in the long term. To put things in perspective, it took decades for the public health community, the basic science community, and the clinicians to understand just how detrimental cigarette smoking was to public health. And it'll take time for this to be determined for vaping products. The good thing is that science progresses much faster now than it did in the past. So that means we'll get to the answer faster. A great example is, how fast we could create new vaccines during the coronavirus pandemic. Science is progressing faster, so it doesn't take years like it did before. We can do things at a much faster pace. But in addition to that, in addition to these studies that showed the chemicals that are present, as I've mentioned, there have been studies looking into the impact of just what we call the vehicle, PGVG. So this is outside of what is occurring with nicotine or flavors. So what's happening with just the liquid that is the base of all e-liquids. And what they've shown is that there is a decrease in the effect of these things called macrophages. So this is occurring specifically in the lungs. We have to think about, the unique nature of vaping or smoking is that as we inhale, the direct pathway of whatever chemicals we're inhaling are directly being concentrated in the lung, and that's how they create their effect. So for example, the reason why people smoke typically is because nicotine is a compound or a chemical that will trigger a dependence, but it gets to the brain to do its job through the lungs. So usually, we have to understand that, smoking is unique in the sense that as we are inhaling with whatever device, whether it's a cigarette or a vaping device, the chemicals that are used to, give us the sensation of euphoria, in this case nicotine most commonly, it'll be concentrated into the lungs before it can get into the brain. So that's why typically people that are studying toxicity start with what's happening in the lungs. And so what some of these studies have shown is that with vaping, if we consider just propylene glycol vegetable glycerin, that's the base of all the e-liquids, that it will be detrimental to macrophages in the lungs, specifically in the lungs. And so for those of you that don't spend a lot of time looking at immunology, cell biology, you may say macrophages. What is that? Well, those are some of the cells that are responsible for clearing infections. So if you think of it this way, you can get many types of infections in the lung. Pneumonia is probably the most commonly known type of infection that most of us have heard of. So the job of fighting off those infections in the lung, they're attributed to the macrophages. So if your macrophages are not working as efficiently, or if they're just being degraded and there's fewer of them, what happens is you get more frequent lung infections. This can be something as common as just a regular cold or a viral infection like RSV, which is typically more concentrated in younger aged children, or cases of pneumonia or pneumonia-like syndromes. So it's been clear that when it comes to vaping, the vehicle is contributing to a decrease in the macrophages, and that it is contributing to an increased risk for lung infections. So that's one thing to consider. So not only, this is circling back to the question of, are the vaping devices just composed of nicotine and water vapor? No. And then the on top of that, the chemical vehicle, PGVG, which is composed in these e-liquids, can trigger some negative health consequences. So that's something that everyone needs to understand. Okay, so let's talk about what is one of the next common questions when it comes to vaping. Well, one of the other common questions is in regards to nicotine and nicotine-free e-liquids. So one thing that a lot of people have understood is that nicotine is the primary addictive component of cigarettes, and now it's in different types of vaping products. But usually the other question is, what about the nicotine-free flavored e-liquids that people are trending towards nowadays? And so this is something I touched upon last year, but I still think it's important to touch upon again this year because things continue to change. There are still a number, one of the big problems about the nicotine-free e-liquids is that there's still a high amount of products that are labeled as nicotine-free that actually aren't nicotine-free. So this is something to always consider. But since this is something that I covered in my talk last year, I'll actually provide a link if you want to view that. But the question continues to remain. So in those situations where a person is purchasing or vaping a nicotine-free e-liquid, 100% of those cases, they are also vaping a flavor. And that's really the case when it comes to all vaping products. Whether they have nicotine or no nicotine, they're all flavored. Even the tobacco-flavored e-liquids or e-juices, they're not just nicotine in the vehicle. They actually have the flavors that are associated with tobacco added as well. So the question is, what is happening when it comes to these flavors, when it comes to the effects on the body? So let's first talk about toxicity. So we talked about the macrophage issue in the lungs, and that was attributed to the vehicle PGVG. So what about flavors? So there's a number of labs that are looking at the toxicity profile of popular flavors. So those of you that know people that vape or may have tried yourself, you know that menthol is a popular flavor, vanilla is a popular flavor, a lot of different types of fruits. Green apple is by far, it's in the past 5 years, it's been trending within the top 3 flavors if you look at the different rankings online. So what are these doing as far as toxicity? So typically, one of the easiest things you can do outside of a human study is to look at general cell viability. So you can grow different types of cells in cultures. Some of these studies have shown that cell viability will decrease when you have a high level of exposure to the chemical flavorants. And in this case, there's been significant effects for the tobacco flavor, menthol, coffee, strawberry, and typically they'll compare this to a reference cigarette. So this is a combustible or traditional rolled cigarette as a reference point. In many of these cases, I'll admit they've done these studies at concentrations that are higher than what would probably be seen in the human body, but this remains to, this basically still opens up the question of accumulation, because some chemicals will accumulate in the body and then they'll have an effect that will be triggered after they essentially saturate a system. So this is something that's still ongoing, and it's basically, I want this to be on people's radar. So this can be something that can help with advocacy, with people that are trying to spread knowledge about the harms of vaping. This is something that should be on everyone's radar, because remember, typically people that smoke, they tend to become lifelong smokers, even if it's an occasional cigarette or vaping product. They'll do this over a lifetime. You have to think about what happens after years or decades of use. So more importantly, something that's a little bit more concrete and more defined is, what about the flavors when it comes to brain type effects? So earlier I mentioned that nicotine is the primary addictive component of tobacco products, and that includes chewing tobacco, cigarettes. This also includes vaping products. But one of the things that's been shown more recently is that the flavors themselves, outside of nicotine, may be triggering a addiction-related phenotype. And this is something that my lab focuses on itself, and we're actually funded to look at this. So one of the primary focuses has been green apple flavors, and that's mostly due to the fact that it's as popular as menthol in the early phases of vaping. It continues to be popular along with other types of fruit flavors, and basically the hypothesis was, since they're so popular, this could be due to what we call a reinforcing effect. Basically, you're exposed to the chemical, it does something to the brain that triggers an individual to continue to use it. So we're a lab that is we use animal models. There's a lot of different techniques that we can use, and what we found is that the mice that we use in our lab, we actually can train them to vape, and we can then give them different options of vaping products and essentially just see how they behave. And just like humans, rats will work, or rats or mice will work to a certain degree to continue to imbibe a substance. And what we've seen is that the green apple flavors, the mice will work just as hard for them, sometimes harder, compared to nicotine, or even nicotine with menthol, which from our research perspective is the most reinforcing when it comes to the nicotine containing product lines. So what does this say? What this says that when you consider people that may be vaping zero nicotine e-liquids, the ones that may prefer things like green apple, it could be due to the fact that they are actually having an addiction related phenotype, that they may become dependent upon it, similar to what may be happening to nicotine. So, this is one of those things that, commonly I hear people say, oh, I'm not vaping nicotine, I'm just, vaping a flavor, it's not bad for you. Well, this is one of those things where we just don't know yet. So it's been clear that through the studies that we've conducted and others have conducted, is that green apple flavors can change the brain in a way that's similar but unique to what nicotine is doing. And essentially what happens is the mice that we've experimented with have an enhanced dopamine transmission. Okay, so this just goes to show that if this is happening with one profile of flavors, it is possible that it's happening with other types of flavors. So for those of you that are advocating in your areas, use this as something to communicate with the people that you're working with, that the flavors themselves may be addictive, and the flavors themselves are changing the brain, and that could be something that would lead a person to be vaping long term despite negative health consequences. This will circle back to the things like the impact on macrophages and lung infections. So that said, one of the things I also wanted to throw out there is that, say you wanted to go the extra step, and say you wanted to, basically become one of the people that helps increase our understanding of the health risks associated with this, or even how to make things better. As far as public health communication, taking medical knowledge and spreading it for public viewing, public assessment, public understanding. So one of the things I wanted to put out there, and I'll put the links here, is that there are these training centers for people that want to go into either basic science studying tobacco related diseases, or regulation of tobacco products. And so these are called Tobacco Centers of Research Science. They're they're spread throughout the country, and they can provide opportunities for those of you that want to get. So since you're young, this will be in the future for you, because these are typically graduate programs, and but they basically are highly focused on training people in this field to go out and basically make an impact on public health. And personally, some of my colleagues, I myself have benefited from this, and I've been able to get trained at these very prestigious institutions, and then come back back to my home region and help make things better. So these are things that are available to you, and you can pursue them if that's where your interest lies. So thanks for your time. Thanks for your interest, and thanks for everything that you all do. And if you think I could help you in any way, feel free to contact me, and I'll do what I can do.